maybe your role in the chat, so that we can know who's in the room. I know we have a lot of people from Virginia, definitely, as this is event as part of Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia, but we have people from all over the country and all over the world. I was just emailing with somebody from Scotland who didn't have the right link for this, but was super excited about being here. So I'm super excited about the impact that we get to have today in sharing these concepts. Like Kristen said, we're going to start off talking about trauma-informed care, because that's kind of the foundation of what we're going to do. And then we're going to take this riff off, this progressive view, and incorporate it in healing-centered engagement, and try to tie the two together. So super excited. The link on the screen, which I will throw in the chat, or if somebody's a better, faster typer than I am, feel free to do that. This is a link from Resilience Week, which I didn't have a chance to rebrand, I realized, because we're reusing this slide deck, but feel free to use that link and it will get you to a PDF of this entire PowerPoint. Everything you see on the screen, you'll have access to, in addition to a resource sheet and some other thoughts about healing-centered engagement and trauma-informed care. So hopefully that will be useful. I'll throw that link in the chat as we progress on as well. So childsavers.link/Resilience Week 2021. So we're going to talk about trauma and trauma-informed care, which is kind of the foundation. Again, healing-centered engagement is kind of an add-on, or we see it as an add-on to take trauma-informed care to a different level. And so let's define trauma. What is trauma in the first place? We think of trauma as being this definition that we commonly refer to from SAMHSA as being the 3 E's definition. Trauma is first and foremost an event. It's something that happens to a person. And oftentimes when we think of trauma and trauma-informed care, we think of it as just being that event. And there are definitely some events that we could argue are definitely trauma for a person. If we talk about child abuse, I don't think anyone's going to make the argument that child abuse would not be a trauma for an individual. But there are definitely other things that might be more of a trauma for one person and less of a trauma for another, or might be a trauma for one person and not a trauma at all for other people. For instance, encountering a snake or a wild dog in the woods, or even seeing a bear in the woods. All of those type things might be events that for one person might be super scary and overwhelming, and other people it might not. Bruce Perry did a great job of talking about the difference between a positive stress and a toxic stress. And a positive stress is something that's moderate, predictable, and controllable. So if let's see, Amanda. I see Amanda on my screen, my buddy Amanda. So if Amanda and I are taking a walk in the woods and we encounter a snake comes across our path. As we're taking a walk in the woods, Amanda might look at that snake and say, oh, a snake. I'm going to take a gentle step back. I'm going to observe that snake, watch that snake, and let that snake do its thing, because that's not an unmanageable, uncontrollable, unpredictable situation. Because Amanda's been around snakes before, and Amanda knows that that's not an overwhelming kind of experience for her, because she's cool with snakes. She might, if we're taking that walk in the woods, as she looks at that snake, takes her step back, she looks back at me after that snake has wriggled off into the underbrush and gone along its way. And she looks back and turns towards me and says, John, let's keep going on our walk. And I'm not there anymore, because I saw that snake and said, wow, that is an unpredictable, uncontrollable, unmanageable situation. And that is overwhelming. That is super scary. That might even be life-threatening for me. So I run for the hills. And she turns around, I'm not there anymore. We experienced that same event of seeing a snake 5 feet in front of us in the path. We experienced that same event in very different ways. Amanda experienced that as something that was cool and okay. I experienced that as something that's unpredictable, unmanageable, uncontrollable. It's overwhelming. It's life-threatening. It's super scary to me. So when we talk about trauma, that second E, how an individual experiences it, is super important, because that's where we can understand how we can support people and whether it's trauma in the first place. And then the third E is the effects. That's what we get to see. That's what educators in the classroom get to see in terms of behavior and behavior problems. That's what we in our communities and our society get to see when people are doing things that end up with getting them in trouble, whatever that means. The behaviors that we don't like to see, whether that's something like shoplifting or substance abuse or other criminal activity, whatever that is, those effects, we look at those behaviors and we say, wow, we don't like those. Those are unacceptable, or we want to change those. Or sometimes we want to support an individual as they work through those. But those are what we get to see. And we usually don't tie the event with the effects. We see an event, we say, oh, that might be trauma. We see the effects and we say, oh, that person's a jerk, or that person's frustrating us, or whatever. But we have to tie it through how someone experiences that, because that's how we can create better interventions to support people. When we look at that middle E, that how an individual experiences an event of trauma, trauma is always a loss. It always takes something away from me. And that loss is what motivates my behavior, those effects, that third E. And that might come out as power and control. That might come out as a sense of boundaries, needing a big sense of boundaries. It might come out as part of that self-destructive behavior, that need for a positive sense of self, but I don't know how to get that. So I so desperately need it that I sabotage my own, because I want to be good at being bad, because it's a lot easier to be good at being bad than it is to be good at being good and consistent at being good. So maybe I sabotage my own success by engaging in, again, criminal activity and making that choice to do that, to prove to the world that I'm a rotten person, whatever that means. So that second E, how someone experiences it, creates that loss or need, and then that's how we can create that intervention to support people, to support their need for power and control, because everybody needs some power and control in their lives, to support their need for attention. Everybody needs some attention, but if you have a fourth grader in a classroom, if they're not getting attention in healthy ways, they're probably going to demand that and command that in unhealthy ways and try to get attention, because everybody needs some attention. So we have to figure out how to meet those needs, and hopefully meet those needs in what I'd call socially appropriate ways, in ways that don't rock the boat, and ways that are more healthy and are going to be pro-social. So one of the basic tenets of being trauma-informed is making sure that we're responding to the need that's behind behavior, rather than just reacting to behavior. This month, I've been doing a lot of work with schools and school districts across the state of Virginia. And oftentimes I'll stand in a room with a bunch of school teachers. I love it when the superintendent's in the room, and I'll ask a simple question. How many of you know a kid who's been suspended from school? Almost every teacher, particularly middle school and high school teachers, can raise their hand and say, yes, I know somebody who's been suspended from school. And then I'll ask a follow-up question, a second question, which is, how many of you know a kid who's been suspended from school and came back from that suspension with better behavior? Almost every hand goes down. A few can stay up, but almost every hand goes down, because it's pretty rare. Suspension does not do a good job of helping people to figure out, to have better behavior. Not at all. So we have to respond to the need, which is what we saw in that previous slide of potential needs. Because if someone's need is for power and control, our response might be very different than if their need is for attention, or if their need is for a positive sense of self. So responding to the need rather than reacting to behavior. What's really important and gets lost in a lot of trauma-informed care education, in my experience, is the fact that sometimes people interpret this as we're making excuses for behavior. We're giving people free passes for their inappropriate behavior because they have these needs. Not at all. That's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is we need effective interventions to actually respond to the need so that we can change those behaviors in effective ways. If any of you have ever seen the movie Paper Tigers, they do a great job in that movie by KPJR Films, in Paper Tigers, of illustrating this within a high school setting, of how do we really look at what the need is behind behavior to have effective consequences in a high school setting. The other question that we really need to ask is this: what happened to you? Instead of the question of what's wrong with you. And we're going to take an extension on this down the road today as we talk about healing-centered engagement. But this question, what happened to you, is important because it engages in relationship. It says, I want to connect with you. I don't just want to connect with your problem, which is what we're looking for when we ask the question, what's wrong with you? I want to engage with you in your relationship and your experience, because your experience makes you who you are. We are all the sum of our life experiences. That's what brings us together, what makes us who we are. And the result of that, I never get to take that awful thing that happened to me at the age of 12 and make it go away. I will always be the sum of my experiences, both good and bad. What I get to decide is whether I am defined by my worst moments. Again, we're going to talk about later with healing-centered engagement. Some people interpret trauma-informed care as being focusing just on those traumas and just on those bad experiences that we've had. But we do need to explore those. These what happened to you ask that question and tries to unpack those experiences. Many of you have heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. We're not going to dive into the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. There are a lot of other training opportunities, and YouTube videos, and all sorts of other learning opportunities. If you're not familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, I encourage you to take a look at exposing yourself to that. The Community Resilience Initiative out of Walla Walla, Washington, has taken the time to look at ACEs, at this concept of adverse childhood experiences, and look at 4 other ACE categories. And I really like the way they expanded this because, of course, adverse childhood experiences are more than just the 10 questions from the original ACE study, but they added in 4 other categories. One is adverse catastrophic events. Think about global pandemic, think about forest fires, think about global climate change, things like that. Adverse catastrophic events, things that affect us all, not necessarily in the same way, but things that affect us all. Adverse circuitry expressions. That's things like cerebral palsy, like Asperger's, like the autism spectrum, even ADHD, where brains are wired up differently. And that's not to say that being on the autism spectrum is inherently a trauma, but it is when you live in a world that doesn't embrace neurodiversity and is not inclusive of it as a system to make sure that it's set up for success for people with neurodiversity. The third one is adverse community environments. That's where people are living in environments of poverty, deep entrenched poverty, of lack of opportunity, lack of resources, food deserts, food swamps, things like that, where they have communities where they're not able to be set up for success and is really hard to break out of. And that in and of itself can be trauma. And then adverse cultural exposures. That's things like homophobia, xenophobia, racism, sexism, all those types of things that can affect from a cultural perspective that can affect us and drag us down. So these are additional ACE categories, which again helps broaden our concept of what childhood trauma and trauma in general for human beings can be. So quick primer on trauma in the brain, on what's going on in the brains. I have a hard time not talking about this. And this is, even if you've ever been in a workshop with me before, this is pretty new stuff. This comes from the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a professor. She and her colleagues did this work on the predicting brain model. We used to look at the brain as this triune brain model that's on the left-hand side there. If any of you have read the book, The Whole Brain Child by Dan Siegel, he talks very specifically about left hemisphere and right hemisphere, upstairs brain and downstairs brain, which are kind of legitimate conceptually. But the Lisa Feldman Barrett and her colleagues, in the research that they've done, they've also published a consumer-facing book called How Emotions Are Made. And it does a great job of looking at this integrated predictive brain model that really looks at more from more of a holistic perspective of what a brain does, how emotions are created, and specifically the emotion of fear or safety, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So when we experience something, when Amanda and I experienced that snake in the woods, we both had the same exact sensory input. We both had the same snake, a 5-foot-long black snake that was 5 feet in front of us that came across our path. We had the same sensory input. And this is where it changes. This is where it's a little counterintuitive. Most of us would think that we react to the sight of that snake and have a sense of fear or safety. Well, that's not the way it is. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research says that we make a statistical prediction about what's going to happen next. Amanda looks at that snake, and what she does is she looks back at her history. She looks back at her history and she says, what happens when I'm around snakes? And Amanda looked at that snake and said, oh, there's a snake in front of me, but you know what? I'm okay with snakes. Because when I was 13, I went to the zoo or to the wildlife refuge or wherever that was, and I had a positive experience with a snake within a safe environment, again, moderate, predictable, and controllable. She was in a safe environment. She was able to make choices as to how much she wanted to participate or not. She was able to hold a snake, touch a snake, again, in a controllable, predictable environment. She wasn't overwhelmed with the snake, and that helped her feel safe around snakes. So she knew that she could take a step back. She could do whatever she needed to do to make sure that she felt safe in that moment. I looked at that snake and I look back at my history and I make a different prediction. I look back at my history and I remember that camp out when I was 12, when the other kids who I was with found a snake, put it in my sleeping bag, and I didn't find it till I went to bed that night. And that terrified me. So I've had bad experiences with snakes. So I look back at that history and I predict threat. Amanda looks at this snake and looks back at her history and predicts safety. Oops. And then we both have sensations. We both have these internal body experiences. Amanda's body is calm. She takes a deep breath. She feels safe. She knows what she can do to get through this. She knows that she can remove herself from the situation. So her body feels calm. Her breath is even. Her heart rate is steady. She has this calm sensation. I look at that snake and my heart rate starts going faster and my lungs dilate and my body starts getting ready to fight or to run because I want to stay safe. And then we have our emotion. Only here do we have our emotion. And this is where Amanda feels safe. And this is where I feel scared. Now, what could happen here is if I were to have a positive experience, Amanda might step back and put her hand on my shoulder. We both take a step back together. And she says, John, take a deep breath. I think we're going to be okay. I'm here with you. You're not alone. You know what? If that snake comes towards us, we can get away. But I think we're going to be safe. Let's try to see if we can get through this. And that's going to create a positive experience for me. But without that, I predicted threat, and that made me have fear in this emotional moment. We both have an impact on our energy because I'm drained. That fight or flight is draining for me. It's an awful experience. Amanda felt safe. That's a positive experience. And that reinforces our experience of what snakes are like. I'm reinforced for the fact that bad things happen when I'm around snakes. Maybe my hippocampus in my brain, which makes memories, maybe my memory brain, when I'm in survival mode, might actually say, not only snakes are bad, I might say these woods are bad. Or I might even say Amanda's bad. I don't want to go take a walk with Amanda because when I take a walk with Amanda, I end up encountering a snake. And that's not a good thing. And that reinforces the fact bad things happen when I'm around snakes. Amanda took her deep breath. She felt nice and safe in that moment. And therefore, she gets reinforced for the fact that she can get through moments. They don't have to be scary when she's around snakes. It's the same thing for everything. I worked for 6 years with 8 teenage girls who lived in our house in foster care. And unfortunately, I was seen as a threat by many of those girls because of their experiences with adult men in their lives. That when they encountered me as an adult male, regardless of what I was actually doing, they looked back at their history and said, bad things happen when I'm around a man, an adult male. Therefore, I'm going to predict that something bad is going to happen now. Regardless of what I actually do, they predict bad things are going to happen here. So therefore, they predict threat, they feel fear, and then that gets reinforced because their body feels this disruption, this dysregulation, and that reinforces the fact that bad things happen when we're around men. The way that we change that, we can't change today. What we can do is we can work differently today so that tomorrow is different. So that maybe if they have a positive, safe experience today, that tomorrow they can look back at their history and they have that safe experience today. That Amanda put her hand on my shoulder and helped me breathe calmly. So tomorrow when I encounter a snake in the woods, I can look back and I can say, I remember that time with Amanda and I felt safe and I got through it and it was okay. So maybe I can get through it again. We have a fundamental network in our brain called the safety network. And that makes us go into fight, flight, or freeze when we can't say, I am safe. We have to ask this question, am I safe? And then we go into fight, flight, or freeze if I don't feel safe. That survival part of our brain that gets activated. And that's really important to understand because when somebody's in that survival brain, they don't have access to things like relationship building and problem solving and delayed gratification. They can't think about consequences or building relationships. That I'm not going to be a good problem solver when I'm terrified when I see that snake. Likewise, when I worked with kids in foster care, if I was a trigger because of the nature of who I am, because I'm an adult male and they have triggers from their history, I can't work with problem solving in that moment. Their thinking brain is offline. We have to create a safe experience and focus on the safety network, not on the learning network. And then we have, if we can say, yes, I feel safe, then we ask this question, am I connected? How am I connected? Am I able to feel connected to other people? And that's this inherent need that human beings have to be connected, which healing-centered engagement really leans into strongly as well. That we need to all as human beings feel connected. Because if I don't feel connected, then I'm going to engage in attention seeking, which is really connection seeking behavior, or the opposite. Sometimes we see this real dysfunction, this paradoxical reaction that I'm so desperate for connection, but I lack the skills to have healthy connections that I'll do the exact opposite. Maybe I withdraw and isolate and I don't want to interact with anybody. Maybe I sabotage relationships because I have this programmed into me that relationships are bad, that I've had bad things happen to me in relationships. Therefore, I'd rather get out of them quick and stay away from them. And then the third network that we have is a learning network. And this is where we want everybody to be 95, 100% of the time, ideally. But this is where, and this is not just about academic learning, this is about being in the parts of my brain that I can access relationship building and problem solving and delayed gratification, thinking about consequences and learning. Super important. But if you ever are encountering someone who's having a hard time, a great way to problem solve that is to think about, do they feel safe? Do they feel connected? Because if they don't feel either of those things, then they're not going to be able to get into this learning brain where we want to be able to plan, function, organize, operate, regulate, all these kind of things that we want people to be able to do on a daily basis. This is where we want everybody, those of us who are in helping jobs, human service jobs, this is where we want the people that we serve all the time. Those of us who are parents, this is where we want our kids to be all the time as much as we can. But that means they have to feel safe and they have to feel connected.
Thanks so much, John. Any questions so far with a lot of the great information that John has given us on trauma-informed care specifically? You can drop those in the chat. John and I will take turns answering or elevating them. As you kind of mull that over, I do want to bring us back to the ACEs study that John mentioned before. Like he said, there's a lot of resources available to us online, free, to understand more about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. But what I did want to highlight is that the study originally it relied on data for predominantly white, middle, and upper class populations out in California. So the Philadelphia ACE study, and I'm going to give you a link to that as well in the chat. The Philadelphia ACEs study expanded those ACE questions to look at community adversity specifically. So they added things about witnessing violence, feeling discrimination, adverse neighborhood experiences, being bullied, or being placed in foster care or other out-of-home placements. And we wanted to highlight that because what that adds is, along with this pyramid here that you see in front of you, chronic toxic stress leads to disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, cognitive problems, high-risk behaviors, early death, disease, social problems. But adding to that are things that are truly beyond all of our control. Some of it is historical and generational trauma. That's also community impacted, race, gender, social conditions, local context. These are things that people don't have influence on and are often born into these cycles. So we did want to name that. Can you move us through, John? Thank you. So John's done an amazing job, he always does, talking about trauma-informed care. But what we wanted to highlight is that trauma-informed care does really focus on the individual level of trauma, rather than what we're going to name as collective trauma, environmental causes of trauma, societal causes, systems of oppression. Trauma-informed care might not look at maybe like, for example, the collective experience of the pandemic we're experiencing right now. That is a collective trauma. So how do you address something on a larger scale than that? A lot of implementations of the trauma-informed approach require individuals to relive their trauma, which can be, we call it re-traumatization. That's part of the healing process. There's a lot of lack of focus on community-centered healing practices. And in some instances, what happened to you isn't the right question. So kind of with the 3 E's that John had introduced us to before, the event, the experience, and the effects. What if your event is not acute, or in another word, what if it's ongoing? So what if it's racial trauma? What if it's microaggressions? What if you are born into a society or a world where you are othered, you are felt different, and you're not afforded the resources that you need to succeed and thrive? And everyone experiences that differently based on their resources, the resiliency factors, the people they have in their lives, and then the resources that the systems that they're in are affording them. So we're going to talk a lot about healing-centered engagement today. This comes from Dr. Shawn Ginwright. A lot of folks were first introduced to this topic through a Medium article, at least here if you're in the US, and that's when it started to build some momentum. And this Medium article really highlighted how we should shift from trauma-informed care to healing-centered engagement, sort of shifting from the idea that, or shifting towards the idea that I'm bigger than my trauma and that I have things that are right with me that I can contribute to the world, not just the things that have gone wrong in my life. Healing-centered engagement is a non-clinical but strength-based approach, and it has a lot to do with advocacy. Dr. Shawn Ginwright worked a lot with youths that have experienced challenges in life and adverse childhood experiences, and applying advocacy as a part of their resiliency and healing process. So it advances a holistic view of healing, recenters culture and identity as a central feature in well-being. I think one point that I'm sure we'll talk about as we explore healing-centered more is that trauma-informed care probably comes from a more what we would call like an individualistic perspective, which is really deeply rooted in Western ideology. But a lot of us come from more collectivist cultures. We come from cultures where we lean on family and community to help us out, thrive. People who are part of church communities or faith-based communities. People that identify with cultures who, again, are just more collectivist in nature. Individualism is really composed in a competitive capitalist society, and that's not natural to us. We've realized that people need people, kind of how John talked about earlier, the connection seeking and building resilience. So there we go, a little bit more about Dr. Shawn Ginwright. John, if you have a moment, if you could link in the chat for folks.
Got it.
And there are some great resources. Again, we want to give a lot of credit to Dr. Ginwright's work. And there's opportunity, if you're interested after we're talking, to find out about any certifications for healing-centered engagement. But he's authored a few books that we've referenced here. And he's the CEO of Flourish Agenda, that's based out in California. So the healing-centered engagement focuses a lot on social determinants of health. So what those are is they impact the likelihood that a person will experience trauma, a little bit like the Philadelphia expanded ACEs started to explore. So poverty, neighborhood crime and violence, and racism. And then again, as I had just mentioned, it looks at people's propensity to manage those experiences of trauma, how equipped they are, and what resources they have within themselves or their natural resources in their world. Family, their community, people that are able to pour into them. So accessing and utilizing those support networks, and then a social safety net. Do they have that, and how is that helping them be resilient or move through this? And then again, just really highlighting, I am more than what happened to me. I am more than my trauma. So where trauma-informed care really observes and looks at the event, it looks at how you experience the event, it looks at the effects of the event, and healing-centered engagement moves that lens to helping to celebrate strengths, helping to celebrate what is right with you, helping to celebrate what you are contributing positively to the world, and not just what happened to you and just your trauma. Who are you? What is right with you? What is right with your community? What is right with all of your contributions and all of your current resiliency factors, your family, your society, and just shifting that lens. Like we mentioned, trauma is experienced collectively. I think that we can all agree after a year and a half that we have been in active crisis, trying to manage and just truly been in survival mode. It addresses the root cause of trauma and those that exist in the environment, not within the individual. So that's to say, healing-centered engagement is going to help us really look at the systems that need to be changed. If you've been part of Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week in the past or already this week. You'll be seeing a lot of opportunities in advocacy and policy change, and that's an example of healing-centered engagement and looking at the root causes of trauma to improve lives through policy and advocacy. It focuses on healing rather than merely coping. So a lot of trauma-informed care and treatment for trauma focuses on coping skills, coping skill development. While that is really important, there are some things that you can't merely cope from because, again, they're ongoing to you. So if it's racial trauma because you live in a white dominant culture, that is ongoing currently. So how are we healing from that or moving through that besides just coping? So we're engaging in things like Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week to pursue justice and name the cracks in systems that we need to change or have impact on. So a lot of political, not just clinical, or not clinical at all, really. It talks about the political spectrum because, again, it's community-based and our community relies on those systems. It's really culturally grounded. So as I said before, trauma-informed care can be really individualistic. And a lot of us come from collectivist cultures. We come from cultures that focus more on family, on relying on one another as groups, on community, raising children in big families like that. So again, it highlights culture, and it also gives you opportunity to heal through understanding your culture more and understanding your community more and celebrating your community more. It views healing as the restoration of identity. So again, if it's culture that we want to lean into is building resilience, and that's part of your identity. And again, asset driven really focuses on strengths and focuses on the well-being that we want to foster and the society or the self that we want to actualize. So we're looking at 3 levels, the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional. And I'd love to talk about the healing-centered principles next. So these healing-centered principles from Dr. Ginwright really highlight just the sort of the value base of healing-centered engagement. So with culture, we're developing an awareness of one's own and others' racial and other social identities. We're engaging in learning. We're discovering cultural identities of ourselves and others. We're being culturally responsible. We're treating our neighbors with care. Agency, it's the individual and collective ability to act, create, and change the root causes of personal, social, and community challenges. We're identifying the root causes of community issues. We're staying curious. We're asking questions. We're challenging authorities that have oppressed us. Relationships, it's the capacity to create, sustain, and grow healthy connections with others. So cultivating transformational relationships. Again, really community-centered, really centered in relying on community and culture to build resilience. And meaning, the profound discovery of who we are, where we are going, and what purpose we were born to serve. So instead of focusing just on your trauma and your traumatic history, it focuses on your future and what you have to offer, the outward and positive trajectory that you are going to impact on life because of how you've grown and all the things that you know. So cultivate positive meaning making about yourself. And then aspirations, that's the exploration of possibilities for our lives and the process of accomplishing goals for personal and collective well-being. Again, just really creating a positive vision of the future. We call it future-oriented thinking for any clinicians or folks out there who have worked with maybe people that have experienced a lot of depression or anxiety or maybe even suicidal or self-harm ideation. Creating a future, helping them lean into future-oriented thinking helps them believe in the possibility of the possibility of what they could do, the possibility of feeling happier or better. So thinking of it that way, just sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy of creating a better vision for your future. And then we'll take some time now just to talk about some of the overlap here, because we do believe that while they are two different lenses, we feel that they can complement one another really strongly, because we don't want to spend our time just observing and highlighting cracks or things in trauma-informed care, because we've seen how it works for a lot of individuals, and we've seen how a trauma-informed lens has reshaped a lot of people's thinking, and how it's shifting the culture to people understanding that people are bigger than just that their behaviors are coming from somewhere, and that they're bigger than that. So here you can kind of see the intersections and the overlaps. As you can see, those are the principles that I had gone over before. And then trauma-informed care principles are really complementary here. Safety, trustworthiness, peer support. So again, with relationships, collaboration, empowerment and voice and choice. And then the cultural and historical and gender issues. And these trauma-informed care principles come from SAMHSA and their concept of trauma and the guidance for a trauma-informed approach. So these are the principles that trauma-informed care utilized throughout. So what do we do with this knowledge? What do we do with these two lenses, and how do we help them work together? So what John did beautifully is walked us through the neurobiology. So understanding the neurobiology of our brain, understanding things like when we're traumatized, we've lost trust in the world around us. We're trying to rebuild the trust around us. We are trying to move through an active crisis, maybe. So maybe healing isn't going to be what's working. And in some ways, healing when you're in active crisis just isn't possible, because we have our rational brains turned off while we're in survival mode. Kind of like when John was talking about the fight, flight, or freeze. So understanding the neurobiology of why you're reacting to things can also give you some more empathy for yourself and some more grace with yourself when you're having behaviors or symptoms that are just the actualization of the trauma you've experienced. Focusing on strengths. Again, trauma-informed care, while it's giving us the neurobiology and the understanding of that, trauma healing-centered engagement is going to help us focus on strengths, focus on our positive outward trajectory, focus on possibility-oriented thinking. We will empower the individual through trauma-informed care, but we're going to foster a culture of connection through a human-centered and a healing-centered approach. We're going to look at how we shift from things like attention seeking, that phrase, and connection seeking. We're realizing that people are just looking to connect. Again, people need people, and we learned that the most in the last year and a half. And then we're working to advance systemic solution. Again, coping with things like racial trauma is just simply not enough, because there are systems in place that are going to continue to impact that trauma and oppress groups and oppress the global majority, instead of finding ways to change that system and disrupt those cycles. So healing-centered engagement is going to come in and help us think of ways to advance systemic solutions and champion policies that will improve the lives of people.
So in a moment, we want to open it up to questions or thoughts. You can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. If you unmute yourself, you'll kind of shoot to the top of the participants tab that we're looking at. We'd love it. I mean, the chat's great, but we'd love to hear voices. We'd love to hear, to welcome in people's voices. I just want to share a quick thought that I have, and I see that Tamika is unmuted and ready to go. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Please correct me if I'm not. When I first saw the Medium article that Shawn Ginwright had published, I was turned off by it. And I was turned off by it because it was not inclusive of what I felt trauma-informed care was. And it took me a while to really digest the fact that a lot of people don't see trauma-informed care the way I see it, or the way I've been taught it over time. And that is to say that I needed to open up my mind to the fact that a lot of people see trauma-informed care as a real deficit-based approach. That's not the way I see it. I see that, and I've done work to make it even more asset-based. But it's unfortunate that a lot of people do think of and train the concept of trauma-informed care as a very deficit-focused. We need to really focus on your problems, and then we need to work on your problems, as opposed to, as Kristen so eloquently put, and Shawn Ginwright has put in healing-centered engagement, we need to focus on what's right. We need to focus on the good stuff, because we've spent way too much time focusing on the junk that you got back here. And that's one of the reasons that, for the past 6 years, when I've trained trauma-informed care concepts, I always put not only trauma in the title, but I put resilience in the title as well, because those two things go hand in hand, that we need to focus on resilience. And of course, resilience comes from our assets, not our deficits. So that was one thing. And we definitely invite you to read that Medium article from Shawn Ginwright. I'll find a link to that and put it in the chat as well. But that's a really good resource to understand from Shawn's perspective what this is really like. On that website, I put the Flourishing Agenda website in the chat earlier. And as Kristen mentioned, there's a whole course that you can take. It's not free, but it's a course that you can take to really walk through what healing-centered engagement is, that's taught by Dr. Ginwright. So it's a wonderful opportunity if you want to take that and really dive more into this. Tamikia, would you like to share a question or a thought? Maybe not.
I'll just add, John, that I feel like when I look at healing-centered engagement and trauma-informed care next to another, healing-centered engagement feels like a call to action. And I find that, at least for myself, mobilizing myself helps me move through my process and helps me feel like I'm making impact, or I have control in a sense of things that maybe I wouldn't typically have control of. So the systems that I'm in, the systems that I'm in, the cycles that I'm in, what are ways that I can shift? Thank you, Megan, for the link to that article. So that's also the other way. Those are the ways that I kind of look at those two perspectives. And when I see them juxtaposed, one feels like a call to action. The other one feels like an internal healing process for myself, building coping skills for myself that are going to get me through my day, my week, my month. But when I'm talking about building a better life for myself and my community, I'm looking towards healing-centered engagement to guide me in that.
Dr. Ginwright's original creation of healing-centered engagement was working with Black urban youth. So again, think about if you got a group of, a big group of 15, 16-year-olds, you don't want to just sit around and talk about the crap they've been through in their lives. That's not a very good healing experience. We want to talk about how to empower these youth to have a positive trajectory in their lives, to be sustainable and to be successful and to be resilient when adversity does come, not just to be rehashing all the problems in their lives. Kristen and I, as clinicians and therapists, hear all the time, people come into our office. The traditional view was, you come into my office and I'm going to ask you about all the problems you've been through. And I'm going to ask you to tell me your story. And sometimes people come in, they say, I don't want to tell you my story. I want to talk about today. And I want to talk about what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't want to rehash what happened yesterday and throughout my entire childhood. I want to move forward. And that's a really important perspective to have that Dr. Ginwright gives us.
And then again, because of the neurobiology, healing while you're in active crisis, and if that crisis is being part of a system that oppresses you, how does that work and what does that look like? So if it isn't through just developing coping skills to manage my day, then what could healing look like? Especially when, again, the trauma is ongoing, we're not able to access the rational thinking and problem solving that we need because we're focused on our survival. It might not feel as big as that, but it is, again, anytime we're traumatized, we are being challenged in our way that we trust the world around us. So again, what does it look like to shift the culture, shift into a more community-centered approach as part of that healing and part of that resiliency building? Any other thoughts or questions, things that resonate with you or things that surprised you? We'd love to elevate those in the chat and generate a little bit of discussion while we have time.
Or ways that you see this applying in the work that you do or in your community?
Just some thoughts that we've had already that I can dig through. Some people really enjoying the community resilience approach. Somebody mentioning, I think there was a reaction to your mention of not food deserts, but food swamps, and talking about, again, that's a great example of community resiliency and a healing centered approach is building out those community fridges. We've got several in Richmond now, and those community fridges are just places where you can grab fresh produce or foods and not feel like you have to go to fast food as your option because fast food is cheaper and it's more local to you. So that's a great example of action towards a community-centered approach. I had one question about how labeling can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. What John kind of mentioned earlier, and John, you can please chime in as well. But I've at least found in my clinical work that a lot of children and youth who are, for example, they've been labeled as the bad kid in class. In that sense, I don't have control of this label you've put on me, but now that I've got this label, I do have control of how I act. And I do have control of how big I make this label. So if you're already going to be mad at me and you're already going to make up your mind that I'm a bad kid, then I'm going to be as bad as I can because I can control that.
Yeah, and that goes in a lot of different directions, whether that's about behavior, whether that's about the kid who has a learning disability or whatever that is, just wanting to be consistent at being a screw up. And because that creates a predictable environment. Remember, the trauma comes from things that are unmanageable, uncontrollable, and unpredictable. And if I can take control of how much of a screw up I am, that's a lot easier than taking control of being an overachieving kid or taking control at, being the kid that everybody likes. Because I can lean into more success there, especially if I have this hunger and need for success, for attention, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of this thing that I think happens in school cultures, unfortunately, that, if we've got the quote unquote, again, it's always quote unquote bad kid. I don't believe in bad kids. I don't think very many of us do, at least in this space. But that sort of legacy that a kid might have in a school, and then that's labeled on them. And all right, if this is the legacy I have, I can't control that. I'm just going to lean into it because you've made up your mind in what I am. You've set out a path of what you think that I could accomplish, and I'm going to lean on that. We've got some discussion on applying this to service organizations or nonprofits, putting extra care in our caregivers and service providers. Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. People are sharing some more resources for trauma-informed care. Thank you so much.
I'll give a shout out to the work of Dr. Ginwright is wonderful and great, but it's not the only thing out there. There's a lot of different ways that this is being applied. As Kristen said, the original ACE study was done, 74% were white, 75% were college educated, and 100% of the original 17,000 people in that study were full-time employed. So not a really good diverse reflection on who we are as a country or people. So and that study's been replicated across socioeconomic groups and racial lines in about 42 states with consistent results, but there's also other applications of the science that came from that, not just application or not just research that's been done, but applications of it, similar to Dr. Ginwright's work. I'll give a shout out to a friend, Paul Abernathy, who is, or Father Paul Abernathy, I should say, who's out of, it's either Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, no, it's Philadelphia. I'm pretty sure it's Philadelphia. And he has a community resilience initiative that he's doing there. And it's a neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block resilience initiative saying all the science stuff is good. What it tells us is we need relationships and we need to feel safe. And how do we do that? By building connections, going into communities of poverty and communities of adversity and communities of lack of resource deprivation and saying, we need to support each other. This is what we got right now. So from Shawn Ginwright's view of that this is a political thing, yes, but also we need to deal with what we got right now as well. So going and doing work, again, block by block, house by house, really working to create community, because we know that community is the backbone, community and attachments are the backbone of resilience, and that's how we stay strong.
Absolutely. We've seen a lot of bigger activity in what's called mutual aid in the last year and a half. So mutual aid is community-based efforts to support your neighborhoods, support your neighbors, your community through through helping them access resources, through share rides, through all sorts of things. And that mutual aid, instead of just handouts, is just relying more on strengths, building people's resources up naturally and helping them kind of build out their own toolkit and their own resources, rather than depending again on a system that is designed with cracks. So it's not just filling gaps, it's helping people understand or access other resources so that they can actualize those for themselves. Someone just mentioned that land-based connections can really heal. Totally agree with you. Thank you for sharing that. Please, any other thoughts or questions, comments on these two ideologies and how they're blending together? And John's just reposted, like I mentioned, the link to PowerPoints and resources.
Anyone willing to share how you see this applying in your own workspace, or even just kind of the initial brainstorm of that?
There is a question of any resources that give some more examples of CRI.
So one is the Community Resilience Initiative out of Walla Walla, Washington. They're the ones who developed the additional 4 ACE categories that I shared earlier. Rick Griffin is their director of training, and is a great person, and I'm proud to call him a friend. He's out of Arizona. In this remote working world, you can do that. Terry Barilla is the one who founded that out of Walla Walla, Washington. She actually worked with Jim Sporletter, who was the subject of the movie Paper Tigers, which I mentioned earlier as well. So the Community Resilience Initiative, they started in Walla Walla, Washington, long before anybody else, looking at community-based trauma and how we can make changes from not only a prevention, but a responsive treatment type way to change outcomes for individuals. And they had a great program. The short version of it is that they had a community-based intervention for a large group of people over a large geographic area. And after a few years, they got their funding cut in half. And they tracked the trajectory of the people who continued to get the intervention and the people for whom the intervention stopped. And the graph, if you will, of people improving at the moment that the funding stopped and the services stopped took a bifurcated trajectory. That the people who kept getting the intervention kept doing good. The people who didn't get the intervention stopped doing good, went on a different trajectory, and no one would, at least none of us in human services who care about people, would ever create a model like that where we automatically take away an intervention from people just to see what would happen. But it was a great way to develop that in terms of some good research and showing that this intervention was really working. And if we sustain it, it keeps working. And if we don't, it doesn't. So they have done a great job. They have a number of different training opportunities. CRIresilient.org is their website, I believe. Community Resilience Initiative. They have a lot of good resources and training opportunities. So that is one that comes to mind. And people feel free to answer these questions that are being asked, because I know that there's a lot of great wisdom and knowledge in the participants here too.
John,
go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, one question about lying or lies as a flight response. Could you elaborate for Christy?
Yeah, and somebody else, I guess I answered directly, not in the public chat. Somebody else had mentioned that as well, and I might have either misspoken when I was talking about fight, flight, and freeze, or something, because I don't usually think of lying directly as being connected to fight or flight. I think the previous question was about it being connected to fight. There are, if you want to dive deep, Heather Forbes has a book, or two books, volume 1 and volume 2, of what's called Beyond Consequences. Heather is a clinical social worker out of Boulder, Colorado, and she has adopted 2 kids. I need to get this fact in my head. Adopted 2 children, I believe, from Romania, possibly from Russia, but she adopted kids who, unfortunately, in some communities, grow up and are born into and grow up their early years in these orphanages with one caregiver to maybe 30 kids. And she made the choice to bring home one kid from this orphanage, brought him home, realized how much of a struggle and challenge it was to help this kid succeed. And then she went back and invited a second one into her home. And this book is a lot of the learning experience that she's had, learning how to build resilience in these kids for whom have experienced a lot of adversity and challenge in their lives and have a lot of reactive attachment disorder and other attachment type problems and issues and trauma-based issues. And she does a great job of paralleling, of looking at these two, looking at a typical topic, and I'll give lying, looking at lying and saying, what's the traditional view of why people lie? Oh, I lie to get out of consequences. I lie so that I don't get in trouble. I lie so that I can get what I want. And then this, if we look through a trauma-informed lens, if we look at the fact that this individual has experienced trauma in their lives, what does lying look like for this kid? What is lying really motivated by for this kid? And it does a great job of looking at those, a lot of different issues like lying, like hoarding behavior. One of my favorites is giving eye contact. That we think of, I need to see your eyes. We say to little kids, we can't move on until I get your eyes. I need everybody's eyes up here. But if I'm a kid who's had bad things happen to me, eye contact might be something that makes me feel threatened. Eye contact might be something that makes me feel way too vulnerable and intimate with you. And I don't want to do that. Or maybe when I gave somebody eye contact, they saw that as a threat and bad things happen. So eye contact might be the exact opposite of showing you respect, and giving you eye contact might make me feel vulnerable and dysregulated and unable to function. You think that giving you eye contact is going to make me focus better, but that might be the opposite of what I need in order to pay attention. I need to not give you eye contact so that I can make my brain engage with what you're saying. But when I do this, I'm not hearing anything you say anymore. So again, Heather Forbes is the author of that book called Beyond Consequences. If you want to learn more about things like lying and other types of behaviors from a trauma-informed perspective. But I don't think of lying as inherently a part of fight or flight or survival response, or not directly.
I think that's interesting too, though, John, because in that sense, and you're like in your example of maintaining eye contact, lying to me feels like distancing yourself from the truth or from reality. So kind of getting distance from that and protecting yourself from vulnerability in that sense as a flight or flight response. I guess I could see it in that sense for sure.
Yeah, it could be kind of a trickle down behavior, but maybe not the primary thing that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. A protective factor for sure.
Is it possible that lying can also protect from the possible consequence of trauma?
Oh, heck yeah. Most definitely.
Like if I've been in a situation and when I was honest, I got a bad reaction, which caused an issue. So if I'm faced with that again, I learn to lie or not be honest, because that way maybe I can avoid said trauma or said consequence.
Right. And that's just down to safety, right? I don't feel safe in telling you the truth. I don't feel safe in processing this, or I'm afraid of the consequences. Definitely. And then, looking at that particular behavior from a trauma-informed lens, but then also from a healing-centered perspective, what do we do to shift culture or shift thinking so that we are building parenting skills or building up skills from caregivers to handle consequences differently, to handle oppositional behaviors in a different way, to handle de-escalation in a more gentle way, or what does it look like to be able to build that system in a little bit more. Someone just added a comment about eye contact again. It takes on a different meaning within an incarceration framework as well, especially if someone is recently returned from that environment. Keeping that in mind can be helpful to interpret that they may seem like avoidance or oppositional behavior. And yes, again, it's a protective factor.
Yeah. And it's, I hate to say it. I mean, it goes back to what we have as conditioning. We can talk about mirror neurons. There's a whole rabbit hole we could dive into here. But it's what is connected, what helps me get what I want or need, what helps me survive and what doesn't. And we get conditioned into that. And particularly when we're in moments of trauma or survival mode, then we grasp onto behaviors a lot more. That if I was in a true threatened moment and I have a behavior that got me through that, then I'm likely to replicate that behavior, to engage in that behavior in the future anytime I feel some sort of threat, because I've learned that that's what helps me succeed. That's what helps me get through it. And even if it's not appropriate for that next situation, even if it's my probation officer, asking me questions to try to help me, be successful once I get out of jail, but I might not be able to give eye contact or feel threatened in that moment, even when it's not objectively the appropriate response, but it doesn't matter because I still feel threatened in that moment. And that's what matters. And yes, it's a cultural thing. Definitely Charlotte mentions that eye contact in either giving or not giving out of respect or out of fear, things like that, is definitely very much a cultural element.
Absolutely. And then kind of, again, if we're utilizing a healing-centered approach, we're recognizing that culture piece of the healing centered principle and understanding different cultures and different identities and how they behave or what is socialized for them, and recognizing that as part of elevating communities.
There was a question earlier about other community resilience models. I'll throw in the chat another one. This is Elaine Miller-Karras, who created the community resilience model, which it's a good model. There's the community resilience model. There's the trauma resilience model, if I'm remembering the names right, which are good. They're very body-based interventions that can be done with individuals. And I've been trained in, I think they abbreviate it CRM or CRM. I think it's SRIM. But it's a good model. I like it. And I definitely use some of what I've been taught with it. But that is there to be shared. And I believe it was Ashley earlier did share that if you're here in Virginia, we have a resource that comes from every CSB, Region 10 and all the CSBs around the state have been trained in the ACEs interface training, which comes from Rob Anda, who was one of the original research investigators, principal investigators for the original ACE study. He and Dr. Laura Porter put together the ACEs interface training, and all of our community service boards around the state have trainers in that curriculum and ideally are deploying it within their service area. So Keith Cartwright at the state level here in Virginia has done a great job of rolling that out statewide. And of course, that's a program that may be available in other states in the United States and other countries as well. I don't know how widespread it is, but that's a great program, ACEs interface training. And you can contact your local community service board if you're interested in attending one of those training.
Thanks to everyone who's stuck with us so far. We're appreciating the questions and exploring all this stuff a little bit more. We've got about 10 minutes left, so pitch in if there's any other things, items, questions, or maybe even something that you're thinking about that you want to change for yourself or for community, and what that looks like for you. Megan, any other shout outs for Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week that we want to make mention of in our remaining time?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank especially you, Kristen and John, for leading us through today's session. I really appreciate all the knowledge and all the resources that have been shared. I recommend, if you are able, there are 3 dots at the bottom of the chat. You can click on that and you are able to save the chat. Every individual in the meeting is able to do that. So if you want to just go ahead and save it, you'll have all of the links available to you. We will also send out an email to everybody who registered on Eventbrite so that you'll be able to have the link to this PowerPoint that John has been sharing in the chat, as well as the video recording. So thank you all for attending. I am going to drop 2 more links in the chat. One is how you can stay connected to Voices. You can sign up for our listserv. But as we mentioned, Racial Truth and Reconciliation is going until the 28th. So there is still 3 days left, full of events. For those who are interested in how trauma-informed relates to the workplace, there's an event taking place at 2 o'clock today. So you're able to see the full schedule and still register for any of those events. But thank you both so much for sharing with us, and thank you to everybody who has attended.
And our contact information is there on the screen for Kristen and myself. If anyone wants to reach out outside of this conversation, if we can do anything to support you in the work that you do for yourself, for sustainability. There was some great talk of self-care in the chat as well. We all need to sustain our own work as well as to help those that we serve and help our communities, help your communities.
Absolutely. Thank you, John, for naming that. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Let us know if you've got any questions, any other comments, things you are reimagining for your community as we've gone through this time together today.
And this was really intended to be a teaser on healing-centered engagement. We definitely encourage you, if you want to learn more, to go to Flourishing Agenda, Shawn Ginwright's website, to learn more. We just want to open up the opportunity to know that this exists, and then go to his website if you want to learn more. Elizabeth, I just got a question about getting certificates of attendance, which is, I'm surprised that it didn't get asked before now. Yes, there is a certificate of attendance that is in that Google Drive folder, that childsavers.link/Resilience Week 2021, because we had Resilience Week back in May, and I neglected to redo the link to this, which I apologize. But Resilience Week is a wonderful event too, and Voices did a lot of great work with that as well. But there is a certificate of attendance for today's 1.5 hours. If that's relevant for you, if that's useful for you, you could frame it, put it on your wall, feel proud about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for joining us. And it's just a drop rippling out, hopefully, of shifting the culture, shifting your thinking, embracing community-centered approaches, and understanding the trauma-informed lens and how those two just really can complement one another.
Great. We'll stay on for a few more minutes if anybody has any specific questions that they want to ask. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.
Well, I could proudly say we surmounted our technical difficulties fairly well.
Yes, you guys did great.
We had a good showing.